This is HOA Violation Vault. The salt bucket was not optional today. I tried to leave for work and Deborah planted herself behind my car yelling that I was violating the snow emergency parking restriction, and she would call the tow driver back unless I went inside and shoveled first. You cannot leave this sidewalk like that. Fix it now. She had her phone up, already recording, and I could see the orange reflective marker she had jammed into the snowbank at my curb like I was marked for death. I was sitting in the driver's seat with the engine running, my small bucket of ice melt on the passenger seat, and she was standing 2 feet behind my bumper, with her arms spread wide like she could stop a moving vehicle with her will alone. Storm clouds were stacking like a wall over Tempe, which does not get snow like this often, and when it does, the Stonehaven Terrace Association loses its collective mind. Deborah Robinson, gate access administrator and self-appointed snow patrol captain, was wearing a black parka with the hood up and a lanyard loaded with vendor fobs and a gate fob, and she was not moving. I work for the city parks department, so I know permits and right-of-way rules, and I knew immediately she was lying. There was no snow emergency parking restriction on private driveways. I rolled the window down and said, "Deborah, I am on my own property. You cannot block me." She leaned in closer and said, "I do not negotiate with winter violations. Your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead." I felt my stomach drop because that line meant she had already written me up, and in this neighborhood a write-up from Deborah was not a warning. It was the opening shot in a certified letter campaign that would flood my mailbox for weeks. I looked in the rearview and saw 2 more cars stacking up behind me in the narrow subdivision street, headlights cutting through the gray morning light, drivers already leaning on their horns. I had moved into Stonehaven Terrace 8 months earlier because the rent was reasonable and my landlord had assured me the HOA was hands-off. That was a lie. The HOA was not hands-off, it was hands everywhere, and Deborah ran the gate access system like a border checkpoint. Every time it snowed, which was maybe twice a year in Tempe, she would walk the streets at dawn looking for violations, and she had a special hatred for anyone who did not shovel within 2 hours of the last flake falling. I had shoveled my walkway the night before, but she was claiming I had missed a section, and now she was escalating it into a tow threat. The problem was my landlord had a strict clause in my lease that said any HOA fines or violations would come out of my deposit, and I could not afford to lose that money. I was already dealing with a lender requirement tied to my car loan, and one more financial mess would put me in default. I said, "Deborah, I shoveled last night, the sidewalk is clear." She pointed at a tiny corner patch near the mailbox where some snow had blown back overnight and said, "That is a slip hazard, and you are in violation of the winter maintenance addendum. I do not negotiate with winter violations." The cars behind me were honking louder now, and I could see one driver getting out to yell at Deborah. She ignored him completely and tapped her phone screen, and I heard her say, "Yes, this is Deborah Robinson with Stonehaven Terrace. I need a tow on Crestview Lane. Driveway violation. Owner refused compliance." My heart was pounding because I knew the tow company she used. They were the same vendor the HOA had on speed dial for every parking dispute, and they did not ask questions. I killed the engine and got out, grabbing my bucket of ice melt. I said, "Deborah, you cannot tow a car off a private driveway for a snow violation that does not exist." She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the vendor fob swinging on her lanyard, and said, "Your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead." I let the meeting move on, because my move was not a speech, it was a document. I did not know what that meant yet, but the way she said it made my skin crawl. The driver from the car behind me walked up and said, "Lady, you are blocking the whole street, move." Deborah turned on him and said, "This does not concern you. Go back to your vehicle or I will report you for harassment." He looked at me, looked at her, and walked back shaking his head. I pulled out my phone and took a video of the scene, the snowbank, the tiny patch she was claiming was a hazard, the cars backed up in the street. She saw me recording and smiled, then said, "That is fine. I have been recording since you refused to comply." I said, "I did not refuse anything I shoveled last night." She said, "The addendum requires shoveling within 2 hours of cessation of snowfall, and snow was falling until 4 a.m. according to the Weather Service, so your window closed at 6 a.m. and it is now 7:15 a.m. And you were attempting to leave without correcting the violation." I stared at her because that was the kind of sentence that only came from someone who had spent hours preparing for this exact confrontation. She had the Weather Service report pulled up on her phone, she had screenshots, she had timestamps, and she had the addendum language memorized. The tow truck turned onto the street, yellow lights flashing, and I felt my pulse spike. I said, "Deborah, if you tow my car, I will file a complaint with the management company and the city." She laughed and said, "The management company reports to the board, and I am the gate access administrator. You can file whatever you want, it will not matter." The tow driver got out, a guy in a gray jacket with the company logo, and Deborah walked over to him like they were old friends. They talked for a minute, she pointed at my car, he nodded, and then he walked back to his truck and started unspooling the hook. I yelled, "You cannot tow a car off private property without owner consent or a legal order." He said, "I have an order from the HOA. That is all I need." Deborah stood beside him with her arms crossed, and the orange reflective marker at my curb looked like a little flag of victory. I had a neighbor, Marcus, who lived 3 doors down and worked from home. He was the kind of guy who sat near the front at HOA meetings and recorded everything on his tablet, and he had warned me about Deborah the first week I moved in. He had said, "She will find a reason to come after you, just make sure you document everything." I pulled out my phone and called him. He answered on the second ring and I said, "Marcus, Deborah is trying to tow my car out of my driveway. I need a witness." He said, "I will be there in 2 minutes. Keep recording." I hung up and turned back to the tow driver. I said, "I am not giving you consent, and if you hook that car, I will call the police." He paused, looked at Deborah, and she said, "Proceed. The HOA authorizes it." He shrugged and kept working. Marcus came jogging down the street in a navy parka, with his tablet in one hand, already recording. He said, "Deborah, what is the violation?" She turned and said, "This does not concern you, Marcus." He said, "I am a homeowner in this community, and I am asking what the violation is." She pointed at the mailbox corner and said, "Failure to maintain a clear walkway under the winter addendum, and attempted flight from the property before compliance." Marcus walked over, looked at the spot, and said, "That is wind drift. It was not there last night." I shoveled my own walk at the same time he did, and this whole block was clear. Deborah said, "The Weather Service confirms snow fell until 4 a.m., which means compliance was required by 6 a.m. Marcus said, "The Weather Service also confirms total accumulation overnight was 0.2 inches, which does not meet the threshold for enforcement under the addendum." Deborah's face went red and she said, "I do not negotiate with winter violations." The tow driver stopped and said, "Look, if there is a dispute, I need to see documentation from both sides or I am not hooking it." Deborah pulled a folded paper from her parka pocket and handed it to him. She said, "This is the violation notice, dated and signed by me as gate access administrator." He looked at it, then looked at me. I said, "I never received that notice." She said, "It was posted to your door at 6:05 a.m. I said, "I left my house at 6:50 a.m. and there was nothing on my door." Marcus said, "I was outside at 6:30 a.m. clearing my own walk and I did not see Deborah on this street." She said, "I posted it and left immediately. You must have missed me." The tow driver handed the paper back and said, "I am not getting in the middle of this. Call me when it is resolved." He got back in his truck and drove off, and Deborah looked like she wanted to chase him down the street. I said, "Deborah, this is harassment." She said, "This is enforcement." and you will receive a formal hearing notice within 48 hours. Marcus said, under the bylaws, a hearing notice requires 7 days advance delivery. She said, the winter addendum allows expedited hearings for safety violations. Marcus tapped his tablet and said, I have the addendum right here. There is no expedited language. She smiled and said, then you have an outdated version. She turned and walked back toward the subdivision entrance, and I watched the orange reflective marker stay planted in my snowbank, like a little threat. The cars behind me finally started moving, drivers yelling at me as they passed, and I stood there with my bucket of ice melt feeling like I had just lost the first round of a fight I did not even know I was in. That night I got an email from the Stonehaven Terrace Management Company. The subject line said violation hearing scheduled, and the body said I was required to appear at a hearing on Friday at 6 p.m. to address charges of winter maintenance noncompliance, obstruction of HOA enforcement, and failure to respond to posted notice. It was Tuesday. That gave me 3 days. The email also said failure to appear would result in automatic fines of $500 plus daily accumulation until compliance, and that the hearing would be conducted by the board with Deborah presiding as gate access administrator. I read it twice and then called Marcus. He said, she is trying to steamroll you. Do not let her. I said, how do I fight this? He said, you need to file a formal rebuttal with the management company, and you need to request a copy of the winter addendum she keeps citing. I said, what if they do not give it to me? He said, then you show up at the hearing, and you make them explain every word. I spent Wednesday morning drafting a rebuttal. I attached the video I had taken showing the tiny snow patch, the Weather Service report showing 0.2 inches of accumulation, and a signed statement from Marcus confirming the walkway had been clear the night before. I sent it to the management company with a read receipt request and a demand for a copy of the winter addendum and any enforcement log showing prior violations. By Wednesday afternoon, I had not heard back. I called the management office and got a recorded message saying they were closed due to weather. I drove to their office anyway, a little brick building 2 miles from the subdivision, and found the door locked and the parking lot empty. There was a note taped to the glass that said closed until further notice, winter storm precautions. I took a picture of the note and sent it to Marcus. He replied, that is not legal. They are required to maintain business hours under the management contract. Thursday morning, I got a second email. The subject line said amended hearing notice, and the body said the hearing had been moved to Thursday at 7 p.m., effective immediately due to scheduling conflicts. That was tonight. I had less than 12 hours. The email also said I had missed the window to file a rebuttal, and that the original posted notice had been documented with photographic evidence. I opened the attachment and saw a photo of my front door with a folded paper taped to it, timestamped 6:05 a.m. Tuesday. The problem was, I had taken my own photo of my front door when I left Tuesday morning because I was documenting everything after the driveway confrontation, and there had been no paper on the door. I pulled up my photo, checked the metadata, and confirmed it was taken at 6:52 a.m. Deborah had backdated her notice. I called Marcus and said, she backdated the notice, I have proof. He said, bring it tonight, and bring printed copies. Do not rely on your phone. I printed 10 copies of both photos, the weather report, the video stills, and my rebuttal. I also printed the management company's closed office note and the email thread showing the hearing had been moved with less than 24 hours notice. Marcus said he would come with me as a witness. I asked if he thought that would help, and he said, it will not stop her, but it will create a record, and you are going to need that later. I asked what he meant, and he said, Deborah does not enforce rules. She runs shakedown operations, and the management company backs her because they get a cut of the fines. I said, how do you know that? He said, because I have been documenting it for 2 years, and you are not the first person she has done this to. I showed up at the hearing at 6:45 p.m. The meeting was in the subdivision clubhouse, a narrow room with folding chairs and a long table at the front where the board sat. Deborah was in the center seat with a microphone in front of her and a stack of papers beside her. There were 3 other board members, all of them looking uncomfortable, and about a dozen residents scattered in the chairs. Marcus sat beside me in the front row with his tablet recording. Deborah started the meeting at exactly 7 p.m. and said, "We are here to address a winter maintenance violation filed against the resident of 482 Crestview Lane. The resident failed to maintain a clear walkway, obstructed enforcement, and failed to respond to posted notice. The fine structure is $500 initial with $50 daily accumulation." I raised my hand and she ignored me. She said, "The evidence has been reviewed and the violation is confirmed. The board will now vote." One of the board members, an older man in a flannel shirt, said, "Deborah, should we hear from the resident first?" She said, "The resident was given the opportunity to file a rebuttal and failed to do so." I stood up and said, "I filed a rebuttal Wednesday morning with red receipt and I have the confirmation." Deborah said, "The management office confirms no rebuttal was received." I said, "The management office was closed. I have a photo of the closed sign." She said, "That does not constitute proof of filing." I pulled out my printed stack and said, "I have the email confirmation, the read receipt, the weather report showing 0.2 inches of accumulation, which is below the enforcement threshold, video evidence showing the walkway was clear except for wind drift, and photographic evidence proving the notice you claim was posted at 6:05 a.m. was not on my door at 6:52 a.m. when I left for work." I walked up and handed the stack to the board. Deborah said, "You are out of order. Sit down." The older man in flannel took the stack and started flipping through it. He said, "Deborah, this shows a timestamp discrepancy." She said, "Timestamps can be altered." I said, "Then let us compare metadata. I have the original files." Marcus stood up and said, "I also have video from 6:30 a.m. showing no paper on that door." Deborah's face went red and she said, "This hearing is about the violation, not about procedural disputes." The older man said, "Deborah, if the notice was not delivered properly, we cannot enforce the fine." She said, "The notice was posted. The photo confirms it." I said, "The photo confirms you backdated a notice after I left the property." She slammed her hand on the table and said, "I do not negotiate with winter violations." One of the other board members, a woman in a blue sweater, said, "Deborah, maybe we should table this and review the evidence." Deborah said, "The evidence has been reviewed. We are voting now." She looked at the board and said, "All in favor of upholding the violation and fine structure." Nobody raised their hand. She said, "All in favor." Still nothing. The older man said, "Deborah, I move to dismiss the violation pending a full evidence review by the management company." The woman in the blue sweater said, "I second." Deborah said, "You cannot do that." The older man said, "I just did." The meeting ended 10 minutes later with no vote and no fine, but Deborah caught me in the parking lot. She said, "You think you won, but you have no idea what is coming." I said, "Is that a threat?" She said, "It is a promise." She walked to her car, and I saw the orange reflective marker sitting on her dashboard like a trophy. Marcus said, "She is going to escalate. You need to be ready." I said, "Ready for what?" He said, "Certified letters, vendor harassment, bogus lien threats, whatever it takes to make you break." I said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you fought back, and she cannot let that stand." I went home and found 3 certified mail slips in my mailbox, all marked as delivery attempts while I was at the hearing. The post office was closed until Monday. If you are not subscribed, hit that button now, because this story is about to go completely off the rails. Friday morning, I got another email from the management company. The subject line said updated violation status, and the body said that while the hearing had been tabled, I was still considered in non-compliance due to failure to respond to the original notice, and that a secondary review hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. It also said that during the interim period, my gate access privileges were suspended pending resolution. I called the management office and got the same recorded message. I drove to the gate and tried my fob. It did not work. I called Marcus and he said, "That is illegal. They cannot suspend access without a board vote." I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Document it and file a complaint with the state HOA oversight board." I said, "We have one of those?" He said, "Yes, but it takes months, so you need a faster solution." I parked on the street outside the gate and walked into the subdivision. My neighbor, an older woman named Linda who lived across the street, was outside scraping ice off her car. She saw me and said, "They locked you out?" I said, "Deborah suspended my access." She said, "She did the same thing to the Johnsons last year. They ended up moving." I said, "What happened?" She said, "They could not afford the legal fight, so they just left." She handed me an ice scraper and said, "You are going to need this, not for the car, for evidence." I did not understand what she meant until I looked at my driveway. Someone had piled snow from the street directly in front of my garage door, a massive berm 3 feet high and frozen solid. I walked closer and saw tire tracks from a plow truck and an orange reflective marker planted on top of the pile like a flag. I called Marcus and said, "Someone plowed snow into my driveway." He said, "Let me guess, orange marker on top." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because it is always the same move. The HOA has a contract with a plow company, and Deborah calls them for special jobs." I said, "Special jobs?" He said, "Targeted harassment disguised as snow removal." I took photos from every angle, then called the plow company directly. I got a dispatcher who said the driver was en route and could not take calls. I said, "I need to know who authorized a plow job at my address." She said, "All jobs are authorized through the HOA management office. You will need to contact them." I said, "They are not answering." She said, "Then I cannot help you." I hung up and stared at the snow pile. It would take me hours to clear it, and I had to be at work in 90 minutes. Linda came over and said, "I saw the truck. It was here at 5 a.m. I said, "Did you see who was driving?" She said no, but I heard Deborah on her phone in the street right before it showed up. I said she called them. Linda said of course she did. She handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "You are going to need energy. That pile is not moving easy." I started shoveling, and Marcus showed up 20 minutes later with his own shovel. He said this is retaliation for the hearing. I said, "How do I prove it?" He said, "You do not yet. You document everything, you keep your head down, and you wait for her to make a bigger mistake." I said, "What if she does not?" He said, "She will. They always do." We spent 2 hours clearing the snow, and by the time we finished I was late for work and my back was screaming. I took a final photo of the pile, the marker, and the tire tracks, and then I left for work. Monday morning I picked up the certified letters from the post office. There were 3 envelopes, all from the management company. The first one was a formal notice of the hearing I had already attended. The second one was a notice of gate access suspension. The third one was a notice of non-compliance for failure to maintain clear emergency vehicle access, dated Saturday, 2 days after the snow pile had been placed in my driveway. The notice said I had 48 hours to clear the obstruction or face a fine of $1,000 plus daily accumulation. I stared at the letter because the obstruction had been caused by the HOA's own plow vendor, and now they were fining me for it. I called Marcus and read him the letter. He said, "That is the play. They create the problem and then fine you for it." I said, "How do I fight this?" He said, "You file a formal complaint, you demand vendor logs, and you do not pay a single dollar." I drafted a complaint letter that night. I outlined the entire timeline, attached photos of the snow pile and the orange marker, included Linda's signed statement confirming she saw the plow truck and heard Deborah on the phone, and demanded copies of all vendor work orders and authorization logs for the past 30 days. I sent it certified mail to the management company, the board president, and every board member I could find an address for. I also sent a copy to the state HOA oversight board with a cover letter explaining the retaliation pattern. Marcus said, "Good, now you wait." I said, "Wait for what?" He said, "Wait for them to respond, because they have to respond in writing, and every response is evidence." I said, "Evidence for what?" He said, "For when this ends up in front of a judge." Tuesday night, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a man said, "This is Bill from Sunset Plow and Haul. I am the supervisor. I heard you had an issue with one of our jobs." I said, "Someone plowed snow into my driveway, and now the HOA is fining me for it." He said, "That was not us." I said, "I have tire tracks and a witness who saw your truck." He said, "We did a job on your street Saturday morning, but it was a standard contract run. We did not touch private driveways." I said, "Do you have GPS logs?" He said, "I do, and I pulled them after you called the office." "Your driveway was not on the route." I said, "Then who did it?" He said, "I do not know, but it was not my driver." I said, "Can you send me the logs?" He said, "I can send them to the HOA management office if they request them, but I cannot send them directly to a resident." I said, "The management office is not responding." He said, "Then I am sorry, I cannot help you." I called Marcus and told him. He said, "That is interesting, because if the plow company did not do it, someone else did, and that means Deborah either hired a different vendor or did it herself." I said, "How would she do it herself?" He said, "She has access to all the vendor equipment because of her gate roll, and she has keys to the maintenance shed where the HOA keeps a small utility plow for walkways." I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Check the shed. If the plow has been used recently, there will be fresh scrapes on the blade." I went to the maintenance shed that night with a flashlight. The door was unlocked. Inside was a small utility plow attached to an ATV, and the blade had fresh snow and ice packed into the edges. I took photos, and then I noticed something else. There was an orange reflective marker sitting on the ATV seat. I called Marcus and sent him the photos. He said, "That is your smoking gun." I said, "What do I do with it?" He said, "You add it to your evidence file and you wait for the next move." I said, "I am tired of waiting, I want this over." He said, "It will be over when she makes the mistake she cannot walk back from, and that is coming. Trust me." I went home and added the photos to my file. That night, I got another certified letter. This one said I had been scheduled for a formal rules compliance audit on Friday, and that failure to allow access to my property for inspection would result in automatic fines and potential legal action. The letter was signed by Deborah Robinson, Gate Access Administrator. I read it twice, and then I realized what Marcus had meant. She was escalating because she was panicking. Wednesday morning, I got an email from the management company with the subject line Compliance Audit Instructions. The body said the audit would include inspection of all exterior areas, entry to the garage and any exterior storage, review of snow removal equipment and logs, and verification of emergency access compliance. It said I was required to be present during the inspection, and that refusal of access to any area would be considered non-compliance. I called Marcus and read him the email. He said, "She is trying to find something, anything, to justify the fines." I said, "What if she plants something?" He said, "Then you record the entire inspection, and you do not let her out of your sight." I said, "What if she refuses to let me record?" He said, "Then you refuse the inspection and you make her get a warrant, which she cannot do because this is not a criminal investigation." I spent Wednesday night cleaning my garage and making sure there was nothing she could use against me. I moved my small propane tank for my patio heater from the garage to the back patio because I remembered seeing something in the rules about propane storage, and I did not want to give her an opening. Thursday morning, I got another email. The subject line said urgent compliance issue, and the body said that during a routine exterior inspection, a prohibited propane storage violation had been identified, and that I was required to remove the tank immediately or face a fine of $750. I walked outside and saw Deborah standing on the sidewalk in front of my house with her phone up, taking photos of my back patio through the fence. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Documenting a safety violation." I said, "That tank is allowed under the fire code." She said, "The fire code does not supersede HOA rules, and propane tanks over 5 pounds are prohibited in exterior storage areas." I said, "It is a 5-pound tank." She said, "Prove it." I went inside, grabbed the tank, and brought it to the front yard. I showed her the label that said 5 pounds. She took a photo and said, "The label could be incorrect. I am citing you pending verification." I said, "Verification by who?" She said, "By the fire marshal, who I will be calling this afternoon." I said, "Go ahead." She smiled and said, "I do not negotiate with winter violations." She walked back to her car, and I saw the orange reflective marker on her dashboard again. I called Marcus and told him what happened. He said, "She is flailing. This is good." I said, "How is this good?" She just cited me for a tank that is not even a violation. He said, because now she has involved the fire marshal, and when he confirms the tank is legal, she looks like an idiot. I said, "What if he does not confirm it?" Marcus said he will, because the fire code is public record, and she is lying. That afternoon, the fire marshal showed up. He was a middle-aged man in a dark blue uniform, and he looked annoyed. He said, "I got a call about a propane storage violation." I said, "The tank is 5 pounds, it is on the label." He looked at the tank, checked the label, and said, "This is fine, there is no violation." I said, "Can you put that in writing?" He said, "I can email the HOA management office confirming no violation was found." I said, "Can you send me a copy?" He said, "Sure." He took my email and left. 20 minutes later, I got the email. It was one sentence: "No propane storage violation found at 4182 Crestview Lane. Tank is compliant with fire code." I forwarded it to the management company with a demand to remove the citation. I did not get a response. Friday morning was the compliance audit. Deborah showed up at 9 a.m. with a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as a property manager from the management company. His name was Richard, and he had a forced smile that did not reach his eyes. I said, "I am recording this inspection." Deborah said, "You do not have the right to record HOA business." I said, "This is my property, I have every right." Richard said, "Let us just proceed. We want to make this quick." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Deborah walked around the exterior of the house first, checking the walkway, the driveway, the patio. She stopped at the back fence and said, "This fence section is leaning. That is a maintenance violation." I said, "It was damaged in the last storm." She said, "Storm damage does not exempt you from maintenance requirements." Richard wrote something on a clipboard. They moved to the garage. I opened the door, and Deborah walked in with Richard behind her. She looked around, checked the shelves, opened a bin of tools. She said, "Where is your snow removal equipment?" I said, "I have a shovel and an ice scraper." She said, "The addendum requires residents to maintain adequate snow removal equipment including a shovel, ice melt, and a snow brush." I said, "I have ice melt. It is in my car." She said, "It needs to be stored in the garage." I said, "That is not in the addendum." She said, "It is in the supplemental guidance document." I said, "I never received a supplemental guidance document." She said, "It was posted to the community website." Richard said, "Deborah, if it was not distributed directly, we cannot enforce it." She ignored him and kept looking. She opened a cabinet and said, "What is this?" I looked and saw a small space heater I used in the garage in winter. I said, "It is a space heater." She said, electric space heaters are prohibited in uninsulated spaces. I said, that is not a rule. She said, it is a fire safety rule under the addendum. Richard said, I will need to verify that. They finished the inspection 20 minutes later. Deborah handed me a paper and said, you have 7 days to address the fence, the equipment storage, and the space heater, or you will be fined for each violation. I said, none of those are real violations. She said, the board will decide that at the next meeting. Richard said, you will receive a formal notice by mail. They left, and I stood in my driveway feeling like I had just been mugged. I called Marcus and told him everything. He said, she is making up rules now, that is desperation. I said, what do I do? He said, you request a copy of every document she cited, and you demand the board meeting be recorded. I said, they would not let me record the last one. He said, then you file a complaint with the state board for closed meeting violations. I am serious. You have to go nuclear on this, or she will bury you. I spent the weekend drafting another complaint. I listed every violation Deborah had cited, demanded proof of each rule, requested copies of the winter addendum, the supplemental guidance document, and all vendor work orders and gate access logs for the past 60 days. I sent it certified mail to the management company, the entire board, and the state HOA oversight board. I also sent a copy to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Tom Brennan, and Marcus had recommended him. I got an auto reply saying he was out of the office until Monday. Monday morning, I got a call from Tom. He said, I read your complaint. This is a clear retaliation pattern. I said, can you help? He said, I can, but HOA cases are expensive and slow. I said, how expensive? He said, $5,000 minimum just to file, and it could go higher depending on how hard they fight. I said, I do not have that kind of money. He said, then you need to settle or you need to fight this yourself. I said, how do I fight it myself? He said, you keep documenting, you keep filing complaints, and you wait for them to make a mistake big enough that the board has to act. That night I got another certified letter. This one said I had been scheduled for a formal hearing on Thursday to address the violations from the compliance audit, and that the fine structure was $2,000 initial with $100 daily accumulation for each violation. I did the math and realized if they upheld all 3 violations, I would be looking at $6,000 plus daily penalties. I called Marcus and told him. He said, she is trying to bankrupt you. I said, I know. He said, do you still have that document you were talking about, the one you said was not a speech? I said, what are you talking about? He said, at the first hearing you said you were holding something back. I said, I was bluffing. He said, then you need to find something real, because this hearing is going to be a massacre if you show up empty. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday going through every email, every letter, every receipt I had from the HOA and the management company. I pulled my bank statements and matched them against the dues I had paid. I noticed something strange. Every month I paid $225 in HOA dues, but my original lease said the dues were $175. I called my landlord and asked about it. He said, the HOA raised the dues 6 months ago and added a management fee. I said, was there a vote? He said, I do not know, I just pay what they tell me. I called Marcus and told him. He said, check the bylaws, dues increases require a homeowner vote. I pulled up the bylaws on the HOA website. Section 12 said any dues increase over 10% required a majority vote at a general meeting with quorum. I did the math. $50 on $175 was a 28% increase. There was no way that passed a vote without me hearing about it. I called the management company and asked for meeting minutes from the past year. I got a recorded message. I sent an email demanding the minutes under the state open records law. I got an auto reply saying requests would be processed within 30 days. I did not have 30 days. I called Marcus and said, how do I get the minutes faster? He said, "You show up at the hearing and you demand them in front of the board." I said, "What if they refuse?" He said, "Then you walk out and you file a lawsuit for records violations, and that becomes leverage." I said, "I cannot afford a lawsuit." He said, "You do not have to afford it, you just have to threaten it loud enough that they panic." I said, "What if they call my bluff?" He said, "Then you hope the documents you already have are enough to make them back down." I said, "They are not." He said, "Then you better find something before Thursday." Wednesday night, I was going through my email archive and I found something. It was an invoice from the management company, sent to me by mistake 6 months earlier. The subject line had said, "Invoice error, please disregard," and I had deleted it, but it was still in my trash folder. I opened it and saw a line item that said legal consulting fee, $2,000, billed to Stonehaven Terrace Association. The date was 3 months before the dues increase. I clicked through and found 2 more invoices, both with the same line item, both for $2,000, both dated in the months before the increase. I added it up and realized the management company had billed the HOA $6,000 in legal fees without any explanation. I called Marcus and told him. He said, "That is it. That is your smoking gun." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "If those fees were not authorized by the board, that is embezzlement, and if Deborah signed off on them, she is liable." I printed the invoices and added them to my evidence file. I also pulled the bylaws section on financial oversight. It said any expenditure over $1,000 required board approval with a recorded vote. If the legal fees had been added without a vote, that was a violation, and if the dues increase had been used to cover those fees, that was fraud. I called Tom Brennan and left a message with the details. He called me back an hour later and said, "If you can prove those fees were not authorized, the management company is in serious trouble, and so is anyone who signed off on them." I said, "How do I prove it?" He said, "You request the board meeting minutes and financial statements, and if they do not provide them, you show up at the hearing with what you have, and you demand answers." I said, "What if they shut me down?" He said, "Then you walk out and you file a formal complaint with the state, and you name Deborah and the management company as co-respondents." Thursday night was the hearing. I showed up at 6:30 p.m. with my evidence file, printed invoices, and Marcus beside me. The clubhouse was packed, more residents than I had seen at any other meeting. Deborah was at the front table with the microphone, and Richard, the property manager, was beside her. The rest of the board looked uncomfortable. Deborah started the meeting at 7 p.m. and said, "We are here to address multiple compliance violations identified during a formal audit of the property at 482 Crestview Lane. The violations include failure to maintain a fence, failure to store required safety equipment, and prohibited use of electric heating in an uninsulated space. The fine structure is $2,000 per violation with daily accumulation." She looked at me and said, "Do you have anything to say before the board votes?" I stood up and said, "I have a lot to say, starting with the fact that none of those violations are real. The fence was damaged in a storm, the equipment storage rule does not exist, and the space heater rule was invented during the inspection." Deborah said, "The rules are clearly outlined in the winter addendum and supplemental guidance." I said, "Then show me the supplemental guidance, because I have requested it 3 times and you have not provided it." She said, "It is posted on the website." I said, "I checked the website, it is not there." Richard said, "I can confirm the document exists." I said, "Then show it to me right now." He hesitated and said, "I do not have a copy with me." I said, "That is convenient." I pulled out my printed invoices and said, "Let us talk about something else. I have 3 invoices here showing the management company billed this HOA $6,000 in legal consulting fees over a 3-month period, and I cannot find any record of board approval for those fees." I walked up and handed copies to the board. Deborah said, "Those are confidential financial documents." I said they were sent to me by mistake. which means they are not confidential anymore. The older man in flannel looked at the invoices and said, "Deborah, were these fees approved?" She said, "They were part of routine management expenses." He said, "Routine expenses over $1,000 require a vote, you know that." She said, "The management company has discretion for legal costs." Richard said, "That is not accurate. The contract requires board approval for any legal expenditure." Deborah's face went red and she said, "This is not relevant to the hearing." I said, "It is absolutely relevant, because these fees were billed right before the dues increase, which means you raised our dues to cover expenses you never disclosed." The woman in the blue sweater said, "Deborah, is that true?" Deborah said, "The dues increase was necessary for operational costs." I said, "The bylaws require a homeowner vote for any increase over 10%, and this was a 28% increase. Where are the meeting minutes showing the vote?" Deborah said, "The vote was conducted by written ballot." I said, "Then show me the ballots." She said, "They are stored with the management company." I said, "That is not what the bylaws say. They say ballots must be kept on file with the board secretary for 3 years. The older man said, "Deborah, where are the ballots?" She did not answer. I said, "There are no ballots, because there was no vote, which means the dues increase was illegal and every homeowner here has been overcharged for 6 months. The room exploded. Residents started yelling questions, demanding refunds, asking how much they had overpaid. Deborah tried to use the microphone, but nobody was listening. Richard stood up and said, "I think we need to table this hearing and review the financial records." The older man said, "I move to suspend all pending fines and freeze all enforcement actions until we complete a full audit of management company expenses and dues collection." The woman in the blue sweater said, "I second." Deborah said, "You cannot do that." The older man said, "I just did, and I am also moving to remove you as chair of this meeting pending the audit." Deborah slammed her hand on the table and said, "I do not negotiate with winter violations." The older man said, "You do not have a choice." The vote passed 4-1, with Deborah as the only no. She was removed from the chair and the microphone was handed to the older man. He said, "This meeting is adjourned, and we will reconvene once we have completed the financial review. Everyone is dismissed." Deborah stood up and walked out without a word. Richard followed her. I sat down and Marcus said, "You just nuked her." I said, "I hope so." He said, "She is going to come after you harder now." I said, "Let her. I have everything I need." He said, "Do you?" I said, "I will by Monday." I spent the weekend going through every bank statement, every dues payment, every invoice I could find. I calculated that I had overpaid by $300 over 6 months. I multiplied that by the number of homes in the subdivision, 140 units, and realized the HOA had collected $42,000 in illegal dues. I sent an email to the board with the calculation and a demand for a full refund to every homeowner. I also sent a copy to Tom Brennan and asked him to draft a formal demand letter. He called me Monday morning and said, "This is a class action case if I have ever seen one." I said, "How long would that take?" He said, "A year minimum, maybe 2. I said, "I do not have that kind of time." He said, "Then you settle, and you settle fast, because the longer this drags out, the more likely they are to fight." I said, "How do I force a settlement?" He said, "You threaten to go public, and you mean it." Monday afternoon, I got a call from Richard. He said, "We need to talk." I said, "Talk." He said, "The board has completed the financial review, and we found discrepancies in the management company billing." I said, "You mean fraud?" He said, "I would not use that word." I said, "I would, and I will if you do not fix this." He said, "We are prepared to offer a full refund of dues overpayments to all affected homeowners, and we are terminating the vendor relationship with the tow company and the plow company." I said, "What about Deborah?" He said, "Deborah has resigned from the board." I said, "Resigned? or removed. He said, "Does it matter?" I said yes. He paused and said, "She was removed by emergency vote last night, and she is no longer employed as gate access administrator." I said, "What about the fines?" He said, "All fines issued in the past 6 months are being reviewed and reversed where appropriate." I said, "Not where appropriate. All of them." He said, "That is not realistic." I said, "Then I go to the news, and I go to the state board, and I name you and the management company as co-conspirators." He said, "Give me 24 hours. Tuesday afternoon, I got an email from the management company. The subject line said resolution of compliance disputes, and the body said that all fines issued under the winter enforcement program were being reversed, and refunds would be processed within 30 days. It also said the management company was conducting an internal audit, and that any homeowner who believed they had been unfairly charged could file a claim for review. I forwarded the email to Marcus and said, "Is this real?" He said, "It is real, but you need to make sure they follow through." I said, "How?" He said, "You show up at the next board meeting and you make them confirm it in front of everyone." I said, "When is the next meeting?" He said, "Thursday." Thursday night I went to the board meeting with Marcus and half the subdivision. The older man was running the meeting now, and he started by reading a statement. He said, "The board has completed a review of all enforcement actions taken under the winter maintenance program, and we have determined that multiple actions were conducted without proper authorization or documentation. Effective immediately, all fines are being reversed, all gate access suspensions are being lifted, and all vendor relationships tied to the enforcement program are being terminated." He looked at me and said, "We owe you an apology, and we owe this community better oversight." The room applauded. I stood up and said, "What about the dues?" He said, "Refunds are being processed, you should see them within 30 days. I said, "What happens to the management company?" He said, "We are reviewing the contract, and if we find evidence of misconduct, we will take appropriate action." I said, "That is not good enough." He said, "It is all I can promise right now." I sat down and Marcus said, "You won." I said, "It does not feel like winning." He said, "That is because it was not supposed to happen in the first place, but you made them fix it, and that counts." I said, "What happens to Deborah?" He said, "She is gone, and if she tries this at another HOA, she will have a paper trail following her." I said, "Is that enough?" He said, "It is more than most people get." I went home that night and found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a check for $300 and a note that said refund of overpaid HOA dues, Stonehaven Terrace Association. I looked at the check and thought about the hours I had spent documenting, the certified letters, the hearings, the fights, and I realized Marcus was right. It was not supposed to happen, but at least it was over. The following week I got a call from Tom Brennan. He said, "I heard the HOA settled." I said they did. He said, "Good, because I also heard the state board opened a formal investigation into the management company." I said, "For what?" He said, "For unauthorized billing and fiduciary violations. If they find what I think they will find, the company is going to lose its license." I said, "What about Deborah?" He said, "She is named in the complaint as a co-respondent, so if the state finds wrongdoing, she could face civil penalties." I said, "Criminal?" He said, "Probably not, but civil penalties can be expensive, and they follow you." I said, "Good." He said, "You did the right thing. Not everyone fights back." I said, "I did not have a choice." He said, "You always have a choice. You just made the hard one." I ran into Linda a few days later. She was outside watering her plants and she waved me over. She said, "I heard you got your refund." I said, "I did." She said, "Good, because the rest of us did too, and half the street is talking about running for the board in the next election." I said, "Are you going to run?" She said, "Maybe, Someone has to make sure this does not happen again. I said, let me know if you need help. She said, I will, and thank you for fighting. I said, I was just trying to survive. She said, that is what fighting is. I went back inside and sat down, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe. Marcus stopped by that weekend with a bottle of wine. He said, you earned this. I said I did not do anything. He said, you stood up when most people would have paid and moved, and that matters. I said it should not have to matter. He said, I know, but it does. We sat on my patio and talked about the neighborhood, the board, the changes coming. He said, Deborah is gone, the management company is being replaced, and the new board is talking about rewriting the enforcement rules. I said, will it stick? He said, it might, if people stay involved. I said, will they? He said, some will, some would not, but that is how it always goes. I said, what about you? He said, I am staying. Someone has to keep the records. I laughed and said, you are never going to let this go, are you? He said, not a chance. A month later, I got a call from the HOA board. The older man, whose name I learned was Frank, said, we are holding a community meeting to discuss the new enforcement policies, and we would like you to speak. I said, about what? He said, about what happened, and what we can do to make sure it does not happen again. I said, I am not a public speaker. He said, you do not have to be, you just have to tell the truth. I said, when is the meeting? He said, next Thursday. I said, I will think about it. He said, please do. People need to hear from someone who went through it. I showed up at the meeting with Marcus. The room was full again, and Frank introduced me. He said, this is the resident who filed the complaints that led to the financial audit and the policy review, and he is here to share his experience. I stood up and walked to the front. I said, I did not want to be here. I did not want to fight. I just wanted to live in a place where the rules made sense and the people in charge did not abuse their power. That did not happen, so I fought back, and I am glad I did. I said, if you see something wrong, document it, report it, and do not stop until someone listens. It is hard, it is exhausting, and it is not fair, but it is the only way things change. The room was quiet, and then someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and I sat down feeling like maybe it had been worth it. The refunds hit everyone's accounts over the next 2 weeks. The management company was replaced by a new firm with a better reputation. The board rewrote the winter enforcement rules to require photographic evidence, advance notice, and a mandatory appeal process before any fines could be issued. Frank was elected board president in a special election, and Linda ran for secretary and won. Marcus kept his role as the neighborhood record keeper, and I went back to my normal life, working for the city and avoiding HOA drama as much as possible. I never saw Deborah again. I heard from Marcus that she had moved to another subdivision across town, and that she had tried to run for a board position there but had been voted down after residents found the state complaint online. I also heard the management company lost its license after the state investigation confirmed unauthorized billing and fiduciary violations. The company shut down 6 months later, and the employees, including Richard, scattered to other firms. I did not feel bad for any of them. The orange reflective marker stayed in my garage for a while, a little reminder of how close I had come to losing everything over a fight I did not start. Eventually I threw it away, because I did not need a reminder anymore. I knew what I was capable of, and I knew I would fight again if I had to. I just hoped I would not have to. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.